It's the OG fact checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. I'm going to continue my focus on artists, but for this episode, I'm shifting to artists on the stage. This is going to be a long one, people, so you might want to get some popcorn, sit back, and relax. I've got a very short list of favorite comedians. For me, the humor has to be relatable and it has to be classy to a certain degree. When I say classy, I mean the stories comedians tell shouldn't rely on lowbrow humor and a string of curse words to make up for the fact that the comedy act isn't well written. If I'm not roaring with laughter, the comedian ain't worth my time. I have five top comedians whose comedy has left me gasping for air and or left me nodding my head in agreement at the social commentary if it's part of the routine. If you have a top five favorite, throw it in the chat. Here are mine, not in rank order. Eddie Murphy, for his delirious and raw comedy films that took me back to my childhood. Chris Rock, for his social commentary that's always spot on, and I love his 1999 HBO comedy special, Bigger and Blacker. Larry Miller, for his 1992 HBO comedy special, Just Words, in which he didn't utter not one curse word and delivered a witty, flawless routine. And Billy Crystal, who I've been watching since he was on the TV show Soap before exploding on Saturday Night Live. My fifth favorite comedian has done routines that have been chopped up into sound bites floating all over the internet for being present. Y'all know who I'm talking about. It's George Carlin. My main source for this episode is Last Words, what Carlin called a sorta biography, co-written with his friend, author Tony Hendra, who put it together after his death. This Air Force veteran and former DJ and writer for the Flip Wilson Show sparked a U.S. Supreme Court case over one of his comedy routines. Some of you may know him from such films as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Kevin Smith's Dogma, and his voiceover work for Pixar's Cars. Others may remember him from a certain skit on The Ed Sullivan Show, which is why the title of this episode is The Hippy Dippy Comedian from Manhattan. George Dennis Patrick Carlin was born in May 1937 in Manhattan to Irish parents Mary and Patrick Carlin. Carlin's mother would say her side of the family was lace curtain Irish, and his father's side shanty Irish, which includes the stereotypes of drinking, lawlessness, laziness, and rowdiness. Carlin's father wasn't lazy. The family was affluent, living in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which stretches from 59th Street to 110th Street, what Carlin called White Harlem. Patrick Sr., Carlin had an older brother, Patrick Jr., was a successful advertising manager for the New York Post during the early 1930s, but he was a loose cannon in his personal life. Of the list of stereotypes of the shanty Irish, rowdy, check, drinking, check, but not on that list was violent and being physically and emotionally abusive to his wife and a 2-year-old Patrick Jr. As a matter of fact, when his mother took the kids and fled from Patrick Sr. to stop the beatings, he broke into his father in law's house looking for his family. His father in law, Dennis Beery, was a tough old New York City police officer, but a day after that confrontation with Patrick Sr., he died from a stroke. Carlin's parents separated when he was 6 months old, the last time his father would see him. To spite the court mandated child support, Patrick Sr. quit his job as an advertising manager, but Carlin believed his father's alcoholism was catching up to him. 3 or 4 years later, Patrick Sr. wrote to one of his daughters from his first marriage that he was working as a kitchen assistant at a monastery in upstate New York. In a 1943 letter to his other daughter by his first marriage, he says he's a disc jockey and a salesman for a small radio station in upstate New York. Carlin didn't know that he would follow his father's footsteps as a DJ until he was 53. 2 years after that letter, Patrick Sr. died of a heart attack. Mary, now a single mother, took charge of her boys, but she played favorites. She saw Patrick Jr. as she saw his father, Shanty Irish, but in George, she saw the curtain lace Irish side of the family. Each boy was treated accordingly. Patrick Jr. was seen as the problem child who needed to be sent away to boarding school for discipline. She wouldn't hesitate to say to him, "You've got your father's dirty, rotten temper, and you always seek out the scruff. You'll never amount to anything." George, on the other hand, could do no wrong. You would think this favoritism would drive a wedge between the brothers, but it didn't. Patrick adored and admired his older brother, and the brothers rebelled whenever possible, especially against their mother and her need to keep up appearances of the life she once had before her husband ruined it all. Mary had champagne tastes and a beer budget, but this didn't stop her from posing. Based on the other hijinks they got into, I feel confident in saying the Carlin brothers hated the system and hypocrisy from their mother and the establishment. A chance encounter led to Mary, her sons, and a housekeeper named Bessie moving into an apartment in the Morningside Heights neighborhood the year Pearl Harbor was attacked. Morningside Heights isn't just any old neighborhood in New York City. It has Riverside Church, a 28-story Gothic cathedral endowed by the Rockefellers, the Juilliard School of Music, where Carlin would walk in asking for piano lessons at 10 years old, the Jewish and Union Theological Seminaries, Columbia University and its Teachers College, Barnard College, and historical monuments like Ulysses S. Grant's tomb. When Bessie the housekeeper left in 1944, Carlin no longer had an after school supervisor. At 7 years old, he mastered the IRT Broadway 7th Avenue line, which runs from South Ferry in Lower Manhattan to Van Cortlandt Park and West 242nd Street in the Riverdale section of the Bronx, and began exploring Central Park, Times Square, Rockefeller Center, Wall Street, and Chinatown. He collected autographs, snuck into movie theaters, did some petty shoplifting and pickpocketing, strolled through department stores, and climbed stairs to the observation deck of the Empire State Building, as well as trees in Central Park. You know, being feral or delinquent, depending on your point of view. Back then, security wasn't a thing, so children could pretty much slip in and out of businesses with little fuss, unless you were being disruptive, and the streets were relatively safe. In Catholic school, Carlin discovered class clown was a role that worked for him, and the more he acted out in class, the more he realized that being an entertainer wasn't such a bad idea. He regularly did impressions of celebrities and neighborhood characters to make his mother and brother laugh, using techniques he honed from being a class clown. It was this desire to entertain that made Carlin, a ninth grade dropout, join his brother in the Air Force in 1954 at the age of 17, with his mother's consent, to get the GI Bill so he could go to disc jockey school. Carlin said that during Air Force boot camp, he gravitated towards the black airmen, most of whom were from Harlem or the south side of Chicago. The white airmen came from farms upstate or out west, and he had nothing in common with them. He could talk jazz and R&B with the black airmen as well as score some weed. He even used his shoplifting skills to boost albums from the commissary for his black flight commander. And in return, Carlin got out of attending boot camp classes. He and the commander would listen to the albums he stole while smoking weed after lights out. Upon graduation from boot camp, Carlin got what we in the military call a dream sheet. You pick 3 duty stations you want and hope you get one of them. Carlin tried for bases in New York and New England, but instead he got Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, which a fellow airman described it as the armpit of the nation. Here is where Carlin experienced the segregated Deep South, along with a segregated air base for the first time. Once again, Carlin found himself in the Black non-commissioned officers club to hang out and socialize. By this time, he was shunned by the whites for being one of those crazy white loving guys from New York City. And if you know Carlin, then you know he really didn't care about what they thought. Growing up in Harlem, he interacted with blacks, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans. Racial and ethnic slurs were slung and received, but by his account, everyone got along. In his words, there was a freedom to hanging out with blacks that ran counter to the structured life of the military. In one way, it was part of my training for a comedic career, picking up a looseness and directness I wouldn't have had if I had stuck with my own kind. A chance encounter through a bit part in a local theater production put him in contact with a guy named Joe Monroe, who was a DJ and part owner of a popular local radio station, KJOE. Carlin told Monroe he'd like to be a disc jockey when he gets out of the Air Force and asked if he could come down to the studio to watch him, and Monroe agreed. When Carlin showed up, Monroe told him to go into the booth and record an ad and then a news spot. Monroe hired him on the spot for 60 cents an hour to do weekend newscasts. The Air Force thought this was great and let him do it because it's good PR for the Air Force and it kept Carlin out of trouble. They pulled him out of his specialty as a mechanic and gave him a special pass to go off base to do the shows. All Carlin has to do was keep his living space in order and report when required. Good deal. It's no surprise that this Irish feral child of Harlem rebelled during his Air Force time. Carlin was foul-mouthed and disrespectful, and one time he even fell asleep drunk at his post. He lost and regained rank or stripes numerous times, was court-martialed twice, and received 5 Article 15s, which is a way to discipline an infraction without going to a court-martial. Carlin said, "My Air Force record on stripes was this. I got 1 stripe, lost 1 stripe, got 1 stripe, got 2 stripes, lost 1 stripe, got 2 stripes, lost 1 stripe, lost another stripe. I earned 6 stripes and lost 4 stripes. By the time I got out, I felt like a zebra." He originally enlisted for 4 years, but with a documented history of being a screw-up who hung out with black people, the Air Force was ready to let him go, with 1 year remaining on his enlistment. In his sorta biography, Carlin said he got out on a 3916, what he called a no-fault divorce, which really didn't make things any clearer for me given his explanation of the divorce. This was driving me crazy. You know, I was a yeoman with a clearance in the Navy, so I did a little digging. Okay, so there are 5 types of military discharge: honorable, general, other than honorable, bad conduct, and dishonorable. And then there's this 6th discharge that's sort of a catch-all for when the others don't exactly fit, which is what's called today an entry-level discharge or an ELD. It's normally given to service members in the first 180 days of their enlistment. And the reason could be the member didn't conform, participate, or had mental health or physical issues. This type of discharge is considered a non-characterized discharge because your conduct while you served doesn't fit into any of the other categories. For example, if you flunk out of boot camp or specialty training that follows boot camp, you haven't been in long enough for anyone to determine whether your conduct while in service was honorable or otherwise. And if you get this discharge after completing training, 9 times out of 10, you probably did something that was naughty by military standards, but not illegal, or you demonstrated a deficiency that renders you unfit for service. I think this is the no-fault divorce Carlin is talking about. Normally, with this type of discharge, you don't get any VA benefits. Carlin, however, wasn't discharged with no ice cream. He got a nice fat ice cream sundae. Regarding the 3916 Carlin mentioned, that is a repealed section in Title 10, Chapter 367 of the U.S. Code titled Retirement for Length of Service. I think they used this now repealed section to calculate his time in service because Carlin had been in for 3 years by that point. The Air Force wanted him out, which was fine by Carlin because he had no intention of reenlisting and wanted to pursue radio now that he had a foot in the door. But he hadn't done anything that serious that would justify any of the other discharges. Nope. It was his nonconformity demonstrated in the court martials and the Article 15s. This was enough to get him an ELD at 3 years and 1 month of service, along with the rest of his pay and full VA benefits that included his GI Bill because of his length of service. And to put a cherry on the top of that sundae, when you enlist, it's for 4 years active and then 4 more years of inactive reserve, during which they can call you back at any time. Getting called back or reenlisting after a break in service depends on the type of discharge and the reenlistment code or RE code, which you can see on your discharge papers called a DD 214. The codes range from R1 to best to R4 being the worst. I have no doubt the Air Force gave him a bad RE code because Carlin stated he was released from inactive reserves as well. Simply put, Carlin, whether intentionally or not, gamed the system through disobedience. Free from the Air Force, Carlin continued his stint at KJOE for a few more months before he took a job with WEZE in Boston to be closer to New York City, a larger market. Things were good until two major events got him fired. He then moved to Fort Worth, Texas for a DJ job there and wound up reconnecting with a buddy of his from his Boston days, Jack Burns. The two would regularly hang out at a downtown coffee shop where they developed a buddy act, riffing off each other, and they decided to make a go of it in Hollywood. They left the radio station, packed up, and drove to LA. After the two get robbed of the last of their money while staying at the YMCA, they have no choice but to return to radio to host a morning show, even though the deal was that they would solely focus on getting nightclub work. After a month, they met up with Murray Becker, connected in show business and a relentless hustler, who becomes their manager. He first gets the duo to record a comedy album, but what kicks their act in gear is a visit from controversial comedian Lenny Bruce at one of their sets. This visit and subsequent endorsement from Bruce led to Carlin and his comedy partner being signed by a big name agency and better bookings. And their goal was to be a crossover act like Mike Nichols and Elaine May. At one performance in Chicago, they caught the attention of Hugh Hefner, which resulted in a booking at the Playboy Club that tanks when the duo satirized JFK and his father, Joe Kennedy, in front of Joe Kennedy. The fiasco was highlighted in an article in Variety the next day. Carlin and Burns worked their act for the next 2 years before deciding to call it quits in 1962. Before they call it quits, however, Carlin gets married after 10 months of a meet cute to Brenda, a woman he met in a nightclub in Chicago. Soon after his split from Burns, Brenda becomes pregnant, and a daughter, Kelly, is born in 1963. The little broke family of three moved to New York City, and Carlin took whatever work came his way while still working the nightclubs like Cafe Wah and Cafe Au Go Go, where he met a comic 3 years younger than him named Richard Pryor. Those days of Kennedy and Camelot affected Carlin's routine in that he becomes more political, especially after he was arrested with Lenny Bruce in 1962 after one of Bruce's performances. Bruce, who was a friend of Brenda's, which is how she and George met, had been hit with numerous arrests for obscenity related to his stand-up routine starting in 1961. Up until the time he died in 1966, Bruce was in court fighting his obscenity and drug charges. From the beginning, Carlin had a plan. He'd get into radio and then from there slide into comedian work to ultimately achieve stardom. He started off great with radio, somewhat, but the comedian part was a long road to hoe. If he could create and deliver a solid 5-minute routine, it might get him on TV. And he does. His act, which he called the Indian Sergeant, landed him on the Merv Griffin show, and it gave him the breakthrough he was looking for. He developed more acts like Al Sleet, the Hippy Dippy weatherman. Soon he's on the Mike Douglas show for repeat guest spots, increasing his exposure until he gets a gig as a writer and comic for the Kraft Summer Music Hall in LA, a summer replacement for the Andy Williams show, where he develops another character, Al Pouch, the hippy dippy mailman. On this show is where he first works with Flip Wilson, another comic working the circuit. This exposure encourages him to try acting, and he started with a small part in Marlo Thomas's TV show That Girl. But successive acting roles rob him of the confidence he had, as he finds he's terrible at it. He turned his attentions elsewhere to record a comedy album, perform at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, and do repeat guest spots on The Ed Sullivan Show. The success he now has is marred by Brenda's deterioration due to isolation and separation, as Carlin's schedule keeps him away from home. She starts to drink heavily. Two historical events push Carlin from his curtain lace Irish comedy to the shanty Irish comedy: the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. No more is he the straight-laced Irish Catholic boy with the play-it-safe talk show humor, what he called the middle-class show business shit. His skit on the Jackie Gleason show, called the J. Edgar Hoover Show, gets Hoover's attention, and not in a good way. The FBI opens a file on him. It's at this point in his career that the Carlin we know today begins to take shape. Carlin's career starts to slide as he's perceived as an artistic dropout who appeared as if he was speaking straight from a hobo jungle. Plus, he was giving off truculent and belligerent vibes, says one critic who caught his show at the Westbury Music Fair in 1973. Carlin agreed with it all, every single word, because by 1969, his act and outward appearance was no longer geared to middle America. He was easing into counterculture subversive territory by growing his hair long, wearing a beard, and dropping acid. No more clean-cut appearance with suits and pencil ties. He's on talk shows now, debating issues and playing coffee and folk clubs. He says, on the talk shows that I did, Steve Allen, for example, or Della Reese, I began to be quite open about my changes and my new values and what I saw as the government's omission and inconsistencies. But the transition resulted in a series of blows to his career. The first blow was getting fired for saying the word ass during a set at the Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. The second blow is getting fired from the Copacabana for deliberately performing badly so he could get fired. He was under contract for the gig, but he didn't want to do it because he felt his act didn't fit there. The third blow was getting fired from his return engagement at the Frontier Hotel, only this time is for saying the word shit repeatedly during his routine, which didn't please the audience, and he was banned from the hotel. The final blow was a routine at the Playboy Club at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in November 1970, in which his material consisted of talk about materialism in American society, press censorship, poverty, Nixon Agnew, and the Vietnam War. Thinking Hugh Hefner would back him up, he left the hotel and drove to Hefner's mansion in Chicago. Hefner, who was playing pool with Bill Cosby, by the way, says to him, "Well, there are two hefts, George. One of them is sitting in that audience, would have loved that material. The other half," and here he was paraphrasing Lenny, "you gotta do business with these assholes." That door closed temporarily to George as well. Being a principled, controversial comic meant being broke. Plans to buy a house in Calabasas were no longer possible, and with little money coming in, they had to move out of the Beverly Hills house they were renting and back to run-down apartments in run-down neighborhoods. This step down from the life they once lived put more strain on the marriage, especially when Brenda found out she was pregnant. George was like, "I can't do this child right now." And because this pregnancy occurs before Roe versus Wade, Brenda had to be picked up in a bank parking lot, blindfolded, and taken to a secret location where her abortion is done for $700. George is committed to the metamorphosis. And even though his life and family were falling apart, he stayed on course and declared his intention in January 1972 with a new comedy album released by Flip Wilson's Atlantic Records sublabel, Little David Records. This comeback album was titled FM and AM, a radio metaphor for this transition, with AM being the old George and FM being the new. He says, "I would no longer deal with subjects that were expected of me in ways which had been determined by others. I would determine the ways. My own experiences would be the subject. I went into myself, I discovered my own voice, and I found it authentic." Feeding off the good energy from FM and AM, he recorded Class Clown and Occupation Fool in 1973. All three albums went gold, and he won a Grammy for FM and AM. Carlin then returned to the stage through college campuses all the way to Carnegie Hall, with some of that money going to cocaine. On the album Class Clown is where you'll find the famous, or rather infamous, comedy routine of 7 words you can never say on television. And now I'm going to repeat those 7 words freely and openly on social media. Shit, piss, cunt, cock, mother, and tits. Back then, when comics made an album, they often used some of the material for their stage acts. And this is what Carlin did in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, using his 7 words you can never say on television routine. And it got him arrested for disorderly conduct because, according to the arresting officer, there were children present. The charge was thrown out 5 months later because, according to the judge, he had no doubt indecent language was used. He didn't believe anyone was violently aroused. On October 30th, 1973, a radio station in New York, WBAI, broadcasted in the early afternoon a different but equally controversial skit from Carlin's album Occupation Fool, titled Filthy Words. Carlin said the DJ gave a disclaimer before playing the routine that equated to, "If you don't like this sort of thing, don't listen." But someone did. John Douglas, a member of the watchdog group called Morality in Media, who was driving with his young son and heard the broadcast. He wrote a complaint letter to the FCC. In the syllabus for the appeal for FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, it says the FCC forwarded the complaint to Pacifica for a response, and their response was, the monologue had been played during a program about contemporary society's attitude towards language, and that immediately before its broadcast, listeners had been advised that it included sensitive language which might be regarded as offensive to some. Pacifica characterized George Carlin as a significant social satirist who, like Twain and Sal before him, examines the language of ordinary people. Carlin is not mouthing obscenities. He is merely using words to satirize as harmless and essentially silly our attitudes towards those words. The result was the FCC issuing a declaratory order granting the complainant. While not imposing formal sanctions, the FCC stated that the order would be associated with the station's license file, and in the event subsequent complaints are received, the Commission will then decide whether it should utilize any of the available sanctions it has been granted by Congress. So basically, the FCC let Pacifica off with a warning, and if they did it again, the penalty would be severe. Pacifica sued the FCC, claiming the ruling violated their First Amendment rights, and initially they won. Their argument was that while the broadcast was patently offensive, it wasn't obscene, therefore, they had every right to broadcast it. But then the FCC filed an appeal in U.S. Supreme Court, FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, that was argued in April 1973, and the final ruling came in July. They wanted to settle this matter once and for all so that it didn't come up again, because there had been increasing incidents of indecent or obscene material being broadcasted or published. So Pacifica's case was going on right around the time of the 1973 Supreme Court case of Miller versus California regarding the legal definition of obscenity, and Larry Flint and his obscenity court cases, one of which was argued in front of the Supreme Court in 1981. Without getting too lost in the sauce, the Supreme Court case of Miller versus California, which was decided in June 1973, was using a previous case that had created criteria on how to determine what is obscene. The 1964 Supreme Court case, Memoirs versus Massachusetts. The criteria are: A, the dominant theme of the material taken as a whole appears to a prurient interest in sex. B, the material is patently offensive because it affronts contemporary community standards relating to the description or representation of sexual matters. And C, the material is utterly without redeeming social value. Now you understand why this was such a big deal for Pacifica. The outcome of the June 1973 case on obscenity was lingering in the air. The FCC's stance was this: the FCC characterized the language of the monologue as patently offensive, though not necessarily obscene, and expressed the opinion that it should be regulated by principles analogous to the law of nuisance, where the law generally speaks to channeling behavior rather than actually prohibiting it. The FCC found that certain words in a monologue depicted sexual and excretory activities in a particularly offensive manner, noted that they were broadcast in the early afternoon when children are undoubtedly in the audience, and concluded that the language as broadcasted was indecent and prohibited by Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1464. Breaking that down, the FCC is saying Carlin's act wasn't obscene by the legal definition, so there was no need to censor it. But the U.S. Code gives them the authority to determine whether language in a transmission is indecent or offensive, even if it's not obscene or profane, as well as influence when is the proper time for such a transmission to occur for the best interest of the public, especially children. Rather than bring the hammer down, they chose to treat the incident as a nuisance, like a noise complaint. Long story short, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision. The FCC won. In their decision, the Supreme Court clarified that the words indecent, obscene, profane may appear to be similar, but they should be viewed separately. Indecent deals with standards of morality. Obscene deals with the portrayal of sexual matters in a disgusting manner. And profane deals with disrespecting something sacred. The court acknowledged that the routine wasn't obscene or profane, but it was indecent, and patently offensive, which Pacifica admitted to in their response to the complaint. Furthermore, when it comes to broadcasts, either radio or TV, the First Amendment can't always be used as justification for broadcasting something inappropriate because of the spaces where radio and TV are consumed in people's homes, cars, offices, outdoor spaces at all times of the day. So it's difficult to avoid offensive material. Carlin didn't like this ruling, of course, still arguing the point that the First Amendment covers indecent, offensive broadcasts, regardless of the time of day or who might be listening. He viewed it as the court banning words and trying to dictate the way we communicate. He felt the person who made the complaint, John Douglas, could have had his son, who was 15, turn off the radio. He argued that all the justices cared about was the kids and what they were exposed to. In his eyes, children don't need protecting from words that are harmless. Unpopular opinion here, okay? Because I think the Supreme Court has a point. While they may have been focusing on the kids, I think it's greater than that. Even though the DJ gave the disclaimer at the beginning, what about the people who may not have heard that disclaimer and walked right in the middle of that routine? They have no context, no warning that it's a comedy routine and that they're being exposed to material they may find offensive, even if it's just a discussion about the silliness of how naughty words are viewed and handled. Carlin's argument assumes nobody cares about what they're exposed to except the uptight, hypocritical right wingers. Sure, you can turn it off or change the channel, but you can't unhear what you just heard. It's like walking in on your parents having sex. You can quickly turn away, but you've already seen too much. Plus, the FCC wasn't trying to censor that material as Pacifica had claimed, merely channel it per Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1464, which is why they issued a warning. Listen, I'm all for free speech. As a writer, the First Amendment is like a commandment. But whether I can just turn off the radio or TV when offensive material is being broadcast at an inappropriate time is beside the point. I shouldn't have to turn it off because someone assumed a few people who don't care about that includes everyone. This is why ABC broadcasted How to Get Away with Murder at 10 p.m. You dig? I never cussed in front of my boys when they were little. I used silly substitutes that I still use to this day. And it's not because I'm a holy roller or a rabid right winger, far from it. It's just that I was raised in a family that didn't want children cussing because it wasn't proper. It was a strict family value when I was a child. Also, kids are like little minor birds. They will happily repeat what they hear from adults, sometimes at the most inappropriate times. So it would have been embarrassing to me to have my 5-year-old stand in the middle of the room at my grandmother's birthday celebration and say, "Happy birthday, great grandma." Getting back to Carlin, he's on top again. And as he finished the 1970s, his success included copious cocaine consumption by him and increased alcohol and drug use by Brenda, rehab, AA, quitting cold turkey, and violent arguments in front of their 10-year-old daughter, Kelly, who does an intervention with them because she can't take it anymore. This chaotic atmosphere naturally affected her, and by the time she hit high school, she was in an abusive relationship, started abusing drugs, and got pregnant. Neither one of her parents knew any of this until much later. The 1980s brings financial problems. He's broke, and he owes the IRS, so now he and his new manager, Jerry Hamza, are hustling for gigs to pay off that debt through HBO comedy specials and performances at middle-sized and large venues. His tax bill appears never ending due to audits the IRS suddenly conducts of previous years and compounding interest. lasting close to 20 years. The 80s also bring health problems. Carlin had his first of many heart attacks and required 3 angioplasties, the second one nearly killing him. Brenda had hepatitis C and breast cancer that received a modified mastectomy. The 1990s bring more HBO comedy specials, a short lived Fox sitcom, a children's show, a few film roles, and 2 more heart attacks, with more open heart surgeries. Brenda received a cancer of the liver diagnosis in April 1997. The cancer was so aggressive, she died the next month. Carlin would follow her 11 years later from heart failure in June 2008. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.